Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 29. Home Sweet Warehouse. Settling into his nest that night after patrol felt particularly cold, and flipping the space heater on didn't do much to remedy that. Feeling the warmth of an actual home was intoxicating. This must be similar to what it feels like to come down from a high. Shivers and everything. Or maybe he was just dramatic and cold. He vowed to put more effort into installing that cat door because having DJ down here filled the same pit in his chest that the Shinsos did. Maybe he could make his own home. Over the past 2 years, he'd managed to make the small stairwell pretty cozy, but this weekend he decided he would spend some time to make it a home. He had plans to turn the nonsense patterns he painted on the wall into strands of ivy, and maybe he could get his hands on some string lights. That always made a place feel more cozy, right? But the first order of business was the cat door. That was going to get done first, whether he had to saw the rest of the way through the door by hand or not. He might not be able to cook up some katsudon down here, but he could do something. It might be a cheap facsimile, but it's not like he could make it any worse. When Saturday finally rolled around and he had a few hours on his hands, he spent some time fiddling around with the inner mechanisms of the jigsaw. It took a few hours, but he was eventually able to get it vaguely functional. Functional enough that it only short-circuited the generator twice before he could complete the small cutout right in the center of the door. And he kept all 10 fingers in place, so it was a success as far as he was concerned, even if the saw smelt like electrical burning every time he switched it on. He'd need to pick up some duct tape or something, though, because the edges of the opening were damn near razor sharp, and he didn't want DJ cutting herself on it. He could make a trip to the hardware store again. Hopefully, they would have some string lights as well. It probably wasn't the wisest thing to spend his money on, especially now that it was running low. He wasn't able to pickpocket the shitty street thugs he brought in as often, with Eraser breathing over his shoulder. Worst comes to worst, he would just have to swipe some pre-made sandwiches from some big box store that wouldn't even realize they were stolen. He was becoming more and more lax with his stance on thievery, but he couldn't be asked to care. Morals often didn't win when your stomach is eating itself from the inside out. Weekdays were usually fine since he got lunch at school, but the weekends often found him dumpster diving, and breaks from school were especially rough. His stash of non-perishables had just been depleted over spring break, and he never wanted to feel that kind of hunger again. It was awful. Shaking his head to clear his mind of the memory, he grabbed the meager amount of cash he had left and headed to the hardware store. The hardware store didn't have a very big selection of string lights, which made sense, given that it was mid-April, but they did have a few different choices for duct tape. There were a bunch of different colors, and he opted for the black one because it seemed the most versatile. Now that he had it back at the warehouse, he realized that it didn't really help the color story going on up here. Everything was gray, and adding black wasn't exactly giving much variety. Though he should probably keep the outside as neutral as possible on the off chance someone's stupid enough to wander into the dilapidated building. He tried to place the duct tape as evenly as he could in order to make it look less like it was a shoddily cut hole in the door covered in duct tape. But at the end of the day, that's what it was. And it was going to look like it, no matter how nicely he laid the tape. He told himself that it didn't hurt to put the effort in. Like everything else he was doing to make this place more habitable, it wasn't going to not look like the staircase of a dilapidated building, but it could look better. It wasn't going to be good, but it could be better. And he owed it to himself to try, didn't he? When he finished, he closed the door and sat down in his usual spot in the middle landing to admire his work. With the hole in the door cut out, he felt oddly exposed. He supposed that's why most cat doors have flaps that shut. It would help regulate temperature, too. Rifling through his nest, he pulled out one of the smaller bits of fabric he had. It was a pillowcase, and it looked like it had seen better days. It was pretty threadbare, but it would do the trick on the warmer months. He pleated it artfully and taped it above the inside of the cat door. It still looked jank, but it was nicer than it was. The washed out pink fabric added a nice pop of color to the otherwise drab gray door and surrounding cement, but it shouldn't be too much to draw attention from the outside. Ripping the duct tape in half down the middle, he prepped a bunch of thinner strips of tape to hold up the string lights he had bought. They were plain white lights that leaned a little bit yellow, a nice warm tone on a dark green cord that would go nicely with the strands of ivy he wanted to paint on the walls. He draped the lights around the perimeter of the landing and wrapped the excess up to the handrail. It was nice. The yellow glow of the lamp in combination with the string lights actually gave off a pretty significant amount of light, and he flipped on the flashlight and pointed it at the ceiling. The harsh LED light would refract and blend with the oversaturated yellows, evening it out to a more neutral tone. He spent some time sketching out the ivy pattern he had pictured on the walls, but nothing he did was coming out quite how he wanted it. Maybe he could look up some reference pictures next time he went to the library. Practicing doodling ivy in the margins of his notebook would be a good way to pass the time at school anyway, so he decided to call it quits on home renovation for the day. Though he should probably sweep up the metal bits left over from cutting the hole in the door and put the half-functional jigsaw back downstairs. Honestly, the whole place could use a round of tidying. Just because it would never really be clean doesn't mean it couldn't be tidy. By the time he was done with that work, it was just about time to go meet Eraser. They'd been meeting almost every night to patrol together for over a week now, and he'd been coming 2 hours beforehand to help Ivy work on their combat skills. It had been going well, and Izuku was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Though he was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. His life was one slip up away from crumbling, and he was painfully aware of that. Shushing up the stairwell was his way of trying to distance himself from that fact. Treating this place like a home implied a permanence that he knew it didn't have, but he could pretend. For the sake of having something to tether his fragile sanity to, he could pretend. End of recording.